Hey everybody, I'm going to read chapter 13 from this book today, Momo by Michael Ende. And this is the beginning of part 3, The Hour Lilies. This is the final part of the book. So chapter 13 is called A Year and a Day. Momo awoke and opened her eyes. It was a while before she gathered where she was. To her bewilderment, she found herself back on the grass-grown steps of the amphitheater. If she'd been with Professor Aura in Nowhere House only moments before, how had she made her way back here so quickly? It was cold and dark, with the first light of dawn just showing above the eastern skyline. Momo shivered and burrowed deeper into her baggy jacket. She had a vivid recollection of all that had happened, of trudging through the city behind the tortoise, of the district with the strange glow and the dazzling white houses, of Never Lane and the great hall filled with clocks, of hot chocolate and rolls and honey, of her conversation with Professor Aura. She could even recall the riddle, word for word. Above all, though, she recalled what she had witnessed beneath the golden dome. She had only to shut her eyes to see the hour lilies in all their undreamed-of splendor. As for the voices of the sun, moon, and stars, they still rang in her ears so clearly that she could hum the melodies they sang. And while she did so, words took shape within her, words that truly described the scent of the flowers and the colors she had never seen before. It was the voices in her memory that spoke them, yet the memory itself brought something wonderful in its train. Momo found that she could recall not only what she had seen and heard, but much, much more besides. Hour lilies by the thousand blossomed in her mind's eye, welling up as if from some magical, inexhaustible spring, and new words rang out as each flower appeared. Momo had only to listen closely and she could repeat the words, even sing them. They told of a strange and wonderful things, but their meaning eluded her as soon as she uttered them. So that was what Professor Aura had meant when he said that the words must first take root within her. Or had everything been a dream after all? Had none of it really happened? Momo was still pondering this question when she caught sight of something crawling across the arena below her. It was the tortoise, engaged in a leisurely quest for edible plants. Momo ran quickly down the steps and knelt on the ground beside it. The tortoise looked up for a moment, regarded her briefly with its dark, age-old eyes, and calmly went on eating. "Good morning, tortoise," said Momo. The creature's shell remained blank. "Was it you that took me to Professor Aura last night?" Still no answer. Momo heaved a sigh of disappointment. "What a pity," she muttered. "So you're only an ordinary tortoise after all, and not— Oh, I've forgotten what she was called. It was a pretty name, but long and foreign-sounding. I've never heard it before." Some faintly luminous letters showed up on the tortoise's shell. "Cassiopeia," they read. Momo joyfully spelled them out. "Yes," she cried, clapping her hands. "That was it. So it is you. You are Professor Aura's tortoise, aren't you?" "Who else?" "Why didn't you say so right away then?" "Having breakfast." "Oh, I'm so sorry," said Momo. "I didn't mean to disturb you. All I'd like to know is, why am I back here?" "By choice." Momo scratched her head. "That's funny. I don't remember wanting to leave. How about you, Cassiopeia? Why did you come too, instead of staying with the professor?" "By choice," Cassiopeia repeated. "Thanks," said Momo. "That was nice of you." Not at all. That seemed to conclude the conversation, as far as Cassiopeia was concerned, because she plodded off to resume her interrupted breakfast. Momo sat down on the steps, impatient to see Beppo, Guido, and the children again. The music continued to ring out inside her, and though she was all alone with no one around to hear, she joined in the words and melodies more and more loudly and lustily. As she sang straight into the rising sun, it seemed to her that the birds and crickets and trees, Even the amphitheater's time-worn stones were listening to her. Little did she know that they would be her only listeners for a long time to come. Little did she know that she was waiting in vain for her friends to appear, that she had been gone a whole year, and that everything had changed in the meantime. The men in gray disposed of Guido with relative ease. It had all begun about a year ago, only days after Momo's sudden and mysterious disappearance, when a leading newspaper printed an article about him. Headlined, "The Last of the Old-Time Storytellers," it mentioned when and where he could be found and described him as an attraction not to be missed. From then on, the amphitheater was besieged by growing numbers of people anxious to see and hear him. This, of course, was all right with Guido. He continued to say the first thing that came into his head and ended by handing around his cap, which always came back brimming with coins and banknotes. Before long, he was employed by a travel agent who paid him an additional fee for permission to present him as a tourist attraction in his own right. Busloads of sightseers rolled up in such numbers that Guido was soon obliged to keep to a strict timetable, so that all who paid to hear him got a chance to do so. He began to miss Momo more and more, because his stories had lost their inspiration. But he steadfastly refused to tell the same story twice, even when offered twice his usual fee. After a few months, Guido no longer needed to turn up at the amphitheater and hand around his battered peaked cap. Having been discovered, first by a radio station and then by television, he was soon earning a mint of money by telling his stories, 3 times weekly, to an audience of millions. By now, he'd given up his lodgings near the amphitheater and moved to quite another part of town, where all the rich and famous lived. He rented a big modern villa set in well-kept grounds, dropped the nickname Guido, and called himself Girolamo instead. Guido was far too pressed for time, of course, to go on inventing new stories as he used to. He began to ration his material with care, sometimes concocting as many as 5 stories out of one idea. When even that failed to meet the ever-increasing demand for his services, he did something he should never have done. He broadcast a story destined for Momo's ears alone. It was lapped up greedily and forgotten as speedily as all the rest, and the public clamored for more. Guido was so bemused by the sheer pace of everything that, without stopping to think, he reeled off all of Momo's treasured stories in quick succession. When the last of them was told, he felt drained and empty and incapable of making up any more. Terrified that success might desert him, he started to tell his stories all over again, making only minor changes and using different names for his characters. Extraordinarily, though, nobody seemed to notice. At all events, it didn't affect his popularity. Guido clung to this thought like a drowning man clutching at a straw. He was rich and famous now, he told himself, and wasn't that what he'd always dreamed of? Sometimes, though, while lying awake at night between silk sheets, he yearned for his old way of life. For the happy times he'd spent with Momo and Beppo and the children, when he was still a genuine storyteller. But there was no way back, for Momo had never reappeared. Guido had made strenuous efforts to find her at first, but he no longer had the time. He now employed 3 super-efficient secretaries to negotiate contracts for him, take down his stories in shorthand, handle his publicity, and keep his engagement diary. Somehow his schedule never left him time to resume the search for Momo. One day, when little of the old Guido remained, he pulled what was left of himself together and resolved to turn over a new leaf. He was somebody now, he told himself. He carried a lot of weight, with millions of listeners and viewers. Who was better placed than he to tell them the truth? He would tell them about the men in gray, emphasize that the story was a true one, and ask all his fans to help him look for Momo. He formed this intention late one night, when he had been pining for his old friends. By daybreak he was at his massive desk, preparing to put his ideas down on paper. Even before he had written a word, however, the telephone rang. He picked up the receiver, listened, and went rigid with terror. At the sound of the peculiarly flat, expressionless voice in his ear, he felt if the very marrow in his bones had turned to ice. He felt as if the very marrow in his bones had turned to ice. "Drop the idea," the voice said. "We advise you to, for your own sake." "Who's speaking?" Guido demanded. "You know very well," the voice replied. "We've no need to introduce ourselves. You haven't had the pleasure of making our acquaintance, but we've owned your body and soul for a long time now. Don't pretend you didn't know. What do you want? This latest scheme of yours doesn't appeal to us. Be a good boy and drop it, will you?" Guido took his courage in both hands. "No," he said, "I won't. I'm not poor little Guido Guide any longer. I'm a celebrity. Try taking me on and see how far you get." The voice gave such a gray, mirthless laugh that Guido's teeth began to chatter. "You're a nobody," it said, "a rubber doll. We've blown you up, but give us any trouble and we'll let the air out. Do you seriously think you owe what you are today to yourself and your unremarkable talents?" "Yes," Guido said hoarsely, "that's just what I do think." "Poor old Guido," said the voice. "You're still as much of a dreamer as you ever were. You used to be Prince Girolamo disguised as a nobody called Guido. And what are you now? Just a nobody called Guido disguised as Prince Girolamo. You should be grateful to us. After all, we're the ones who made your dreams come true." "That's a lie!" Guido shouted. "Heavens," said the voice, with another mirthless laugh. "You're hardly the person to bandy words with us on the subject of truth and falsehood. Oh no, my poor Guido. You'll regret it if you try quoting the truth at people. Thanks to us, you've become famous for your tall stories. You aren't qualified to tell the truth, so forget it." "What have you done with Momo?" Guido asked in a whisper. "Don't worry your poor little scatterbrained head about that. You can't help her any more, least of all by telling stories about us. If you do, you'll only destroy your success as quickly as it came. It's up to you, of course. If you're really set on playing the hero and ruining yourself, we won't stop you. But you can't expect us to reward your ingratitude by continuing to protect your interests. Don't you like being rich and famous?" "Yes," Guido replied in a muffled voice. "Exactly, so leave us out of it. Go on telling people what they want to hear." "Now that I know the truth," Guido said with effort, "how can I?" "I'll give you some sound advice. Don't take yourself so seriously. The matter's out of your hands. Look at it from that angle, and you'll find you can carry on very nicely, as before." "Yes," Guido muttered, staring into space. "From that angle." The earpiece gave a click and went dead. Guido hung up too. He slumped forward on the desktop and buried his face in his hands, racked with silent sobs. From then on, Guido lost every last scrap of self-respect. He abandoned his plan and carried on as before, though he felt an utter fraud. And so he was. Once upon a time his imagination had soared along, and he had blithely followed its lead. But now he was telling lies. He was making a buffoon of himself, a public laughingstock, and he knew it. He hated his work, and the more he hated it, the sillier and more sentimental his stories became. This didn't impair his reputation, though. On the contrary, the public acclaimed him for pioneering a new style of humor, and many comedians tried to imitate it. Guido was all the rage, not that he derived any pleasure from the fact. He now knew who was responsible for his success. He had gained nothing and lost everything. And he still continued to race by car or plane from one engagement to the next, accompanied everywhere by the secretaries to whom he never stopped dictating old stories in new guises. "Amazingly inventive," was the newspaper's pet description of him. Guido the dreamer had, in fact, become Girolamo the hoaxer. Beppo Roadsweeper presented the men in gray with a far harder nut to crack. Ever since the night of Momo's disappearance, and whenever his work permitted, he had gone to the amphitheater and sat there waiting. At last, when his mounting concern and anxiety became too much to bear, he resolved to override Guido's objections, reasonable though they were, and go to the police. What if they do put her back in one of those homes with bars over the windows, he reflected. Better that than being held prisoner by the men in gray. If she's still alive, of course. She escaped from a children's home once, so she could do it again. Besides, maybe I could fix it so they didn't put her in a home at all. The first thing to do is find her. So he made his way to the nearest police station, which was on the outskirts of the city. Once there, he hung around outside for a while, twisting his hat in his hands. Then he plucked up the courage and walked in. Yes, said the desk sergeant, who was busy filling out a long and complicated form. Beppo took some time to get it out. The thing is, he said at last, something dreadful must have happened. Really, said the desk sergeant, still writing. What's it all about? It's about our Momo, said Beppo. A child? Yes, a girl. Is she yours? No, Beppo said uncertainly. I mean, yes, but I'm not her father. No, I mean, yes, snapped the desk sergeant. Whose child is she, then? Who are her parents? Nobody knows, said Beppo. Where is she registered, then? Registered? Said Beppo. Well, with us, I suppose. We all know her. So she isn't registered, the desk sergeant said with a sigh. That's against the law, in case you didn't know. Who does she live with, then? She lives by herself, Beppo replied. That's to say, she used to live in the old amphitheater, but she doesn't anymore. She's gone. Just a minute, said the desk sergeant. If I understand you correctly, the ruins have until recently been occupied by a young female vagrant named... What did you say her name was? Momo, said Beppo. The policeman pulled a pad towards him and started writing Momo. Momo, he repeated. Well, go on. Momo what? I'll need her full name. Momo nothing, said Beppo. Just Momo. The desk sergeant stroked his chin and looked aggravated. See here, old-timer, you'll have to do better than this. I'm trying to be helpful, but I can't file a report without your cooperation. Better begin by telling me your own name. Beppo, said Beppo. Beppo what? Beppo road sweeper. Your name, I said, not your occupation. It's both, Beppo explained patiently. The desk sergeant put his pen down and buried his face in his hands. God, give me strength, he muttered despairingly. Why did I have to be on duty now, of all times? Then he straightened up, squared his shoulders, and gave the old man an encouraging smile. All right, he said gently, as though humoring a child. I can take your personal particulars later. Just tell me the whole story from start to finish. Beppo looked dubious. All of it? Anything that's relevant, said the desk sergeant. I'm up to my eyes in work. I've got this whole stack of forms to complete by lunchtime, and I'm just about at the end of my tether. But never mind that. Take your time and tell me what's on your mind. He sat back and closed his eyes with the air of a martyr at the stake. And Beppo, in his queer roundabout way, recounted the whole story from Momo's arrival on the scene and her exceptional gifts to the trial on the garbage dump, which he himself had witnessed. And that very same night, he concluded, Momo disappeared. The desk sergeant subjected him to a long, resentful gaze. I see, he said at last. So you're telling me that an unlikely-sounding girl, whose existence remains to be proved, may have been kidnapped and carried off. You can't say where to, by ghosts of some kind. Is that what you expect us to investigate? Yes, please, Beppo said eagerly. The desk sergeant leaned forward. Breathe on me, he barked. Although Beppo failed to see the point of his request, he shrugged his shoulders and obediently blew in the policeman's face. The desk sergeant sniffed and shook his head. You don't appear to be drunk. No, mumbled Beppo, puce in the face with embarrassment. I've never been drunk in my life. Then why tell me such a cock and bull story? Did you really think I'd be daft enough to believe it? Yes, Beppo said innocently. At that, the policeman's patience finally snapped. He jumped up and slammed his fist down hard on a stack of long and complicated forms. That does it, he bellowed, beside himself with rage. Get out of here at once, or I'll lock you up for insulting behavior. Beppo looked dismayed. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I didn't mean it that way. All I meant was... Out! Roared the desk sergeant. Beppo turned and went. During the next few days, he called at various other police stations with much the same result. He was kicked out, politely sent home, or humored as the best means of getting rid of him. One day, however, he was interviewed by a police investigator with less sense of humor than his colleagues. After listening to Beppo's story without a flicker of expression, he turned to a subordinate and said coldly, The old man's off his rocker. We'll have to find out if he's a threat to society. Take him down to the cells. Beppo had to spend half the day in a cell before being whisked off in a car by 2 policemen. They drove him all the way across the city to a big white building with bars over the windows. It wasn't a prison or a detention center, as he at first thought, but a hospital for nervous disorders. Here Beppo underwent a thorough examination. The hospital staff treated him kindly. They didn't laugh at him or bawl him out. In fact, they seemed very interested in his story, because they made him tell it again and again. Although they never questioned it, Beppo got the feeling that they didn't really believe it. Whatever they made of him, which was far from clear to Beppo himself, they didn't discharge him. Whenever he asked how soon he could go, he was told, Soon, but you're still needed for the time being. We haven't completed our investigations, but we're making progress. And Beppo, who thought they were referring to investigations into Momo's whereabouts, continued to wait patiently. They had allotted him a bed in a big ward where many other patients slept. One night he woke up and saw, by the feeble glow of the emergency building, that someone was standing beside his bed. All he could tell at first was that the shadowy figure was smoking a cigar or cigarette. The tip glowed red in the gloom. But then he recognized the bowler hat and briefcase. Realizing that his visitor was one of the men in gray, he felt chilled to the marrow and opened his mouth to call for help. Quiet, hissed the ashen voice. I've been authorized to make you a proposition. Listen to it carefully and don't answer till I tell you. You now have some idea of the power we already yield. Whether or not you get another taste of it is entirely up to you. Although you can't harm us in the least by retailing your story to all and sundry, it doesn't suit our scheme of things. You're quite correct in assuming that your friend Momo is our prisoner, but you may as well abandon all hope of finding her. That you'll never do, and your efforts to rescue her aren't making the poor girl's position any easier. Every time you try, she has to suffer for it, so be more careful what you do and say from now on. The man in gray blew several smoke rings, gleefully observing the effect of his speech on Beppo. It was clear that the old man believed every word of it. My time is valuable, the man in gray went on. So here's our proposition in a nutshell. You can have the girl back, but only on condition that you never utter another word about us or our activities. As ransom, so to speak, we shall additionally require you to deposit 100,000 hours of your time with us. How we bank it is our affair and doesn't concern you. All you have to do is save it. How you save it is your affair. If you agree, we'll arrange for you to be released in the next few days. If not, you'll stay here for as long as Momo remains with us. In other words, forevermore. It's a generous offer, so think it over. You won't get a second chance. Well? Beppo swallowed hard a couple of times. Then he croaked, I agree. Very sensible of you, the man in gray said smugly. So remember, absolute discretion, and 100,000 hours of your time. As soon as you've saved them for us, you can have Momo back. And now, my dear sir, goodbye." On that note, the man in gray departed, leaving a trail of cigar smoke behind him. It seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, like a will-o'-the-wisp. Beppo stopped telling his story from that night on, and when asked why he told it in the first place, would merely look sad and shrug his shoulders. The hospital authorities discharged him a few days later. But he didn't go home. Instead, he went straight to the depot where he and his workmates collected their brooms and handcarts. Shouldering his broom, he marched out into the city streets and started sweeping. He did not, however, sweep as he used to in the old days, with a breath before each step and stroke of the broom, but hurriedly and without pride in his work, solely intent on saving time. He felt sickened by what he was doing and tormented by the knowledge that he was betraying the deeply held beliefs of a lifetime. Had no one's future been at stake but his own, he would have starved to death rather than abandon his principles. But there was Momo's ransom to collect, and this was the only way he knew of saving time. He swept day and night without ever returning to his shack near the amphitheater. When exhaustion overcame him, he would sit down on a park bench, or even on the curb, and snatch a few minutes' sleep, only to wake up with a guilty start and carry on sweeping. He devoted just as little time to his meals, which took the form of hurried snacks wolfed down on the move. Beppo swept for weeks and months on end. Winter followed autumn, and still he toiled on. Spring and summer came around, but he scarcely noticed the changing seasons. Preoccupied with saving Momo's 100,000 hours ransom, he swept and swept and swept. The townsfolk were too short of time themselves to pay any attention to the little old man, and the handful that did so tapped their foreheads as soon as he had gone panting past, wielding his broom as if his life depended on it. Being taken for a fool was nothing new to Beppo, so he scarcely noticed that either. On the few occasions when someone asked him what the hurry was, he would pause for a moment, eye the questioner with mingled alarm and sorrow, and put his finger to his lips. Hardest of all for the men in gray to tailor to their plans were Momo's friends among the children of the city. Even after her disappearance, they went on meeting at the amphitheater as often as they could. They continued to invent new games in which a few old crates and boxes became castles and palaces, or gallons that carried them on fabulous voyages around the world. They also continued to tell each other stories. In short, they behaved as if Momo were still with them, and by doing so, remarkably enough, they almost made it seem that she really was. Besides, they never for a moment doubted that she would return. They didn't discuss the subject, but children united by such an unspoken certainty had no need to. Momo was one of them and formed the ever-present focus of all their activities, whether or not she was actually there in person. The men in gray were powerless to meet this challenge head-on. Unable to detach the children from Momo by bringing them under their direct control, they had to find some roundabout means of achieving the same end, and for this they enlisted the children's elders. Not all grown-ups made suitable accomplices, of course, but there were plenty that did. What was more, the men in gray were cunning enough to turn the children's own weapons against them. Quite suddenly, one or two parents recalled how their offspring had paraded through the streets with placards and posters. "Something must be done," they said. "More and more kids are being left on their own and neglected. You can't blame us. Parents just don't have the time these days. So it's up to the authorities." Others joined in the chorus. "We can't have all these youngsters loafing around," declared some. "They obstruct the traffic. Road accidents caused by children are on the increase, and road accidents cost money that could be put to better use." "Unsupervised children run wild," declared others. "They become morally depraved and take to crime. The authorities must take steps to round them up. They must build centers where the youngsters can be molded into useful and efficient members of society. Children, declared still others, are the raw material of the future. A world dependent on computers and nuclear energy will need an army of experts and technicians to run it. Far from preparing our children for tomorrow's world, we still allow too many of them to squander years of their precious time on childish tomfoolery. It's a blot on our civilization and a crime against future generations. The time savers were all in favor of such a policy, naturally, and there were so many of them in the city by this time that they soon convinced the authorities of the need to take prompt action. Before long, big buildings known as child depots sprang up in every neighborhood. Children whose parents were too busy to look after them had to be deposited there and could be collected when convenient. They were strictly forbidden to play in the streets or parks or anywhere else. Any child caught doing so was immediately carted off to the nearest depot, and its parents were heavily fined. None of Momo's friends escaped this new regulation. They were split up according to the districts they came from and consigned to various child depots. Once there, they were naturally forbidden to play games of their own devising. All games were selected for them by supervisors and had to have some useful, educational purpose. The children learned these new games but unlearned something else in the process. They forgot how to be happy, how to take pleasure in little things, and last but not least, how to dream. Weeks passed, and the children began to look like time savers in miniature. Sullen, bored, and resentful, they did as they were told. Even when left to their own devices, they no longer knew what to do with themselves. All they could still do was make a noise, but it was an angry, ill-tempered noise, not the happy hullabaloo of former times. The men in gray made no direct approach to them. There was no need. The net they had woven over the city was so close-meshed as to seem impenetrable. Not even the brightest and most ingenious children managed to slip through its toils. The amphitheater remained silent and deserted. The men in gray had done their work well. All was in readiness for Momo's return. So Momo sat on the stone steps and waited in vain for her friends to turn up. She sat and waited all day, but not one came, not a soul. The sun was sinking in the west. The shadows grew longer. The air more chill. At last Momo rose stiffly to her feet. She was hungry because no one had thought to bring her something to eat. This had never happened before. Even Guido and Beppo must have forgotten about her, she reflected, but she consoled herself with the thought that it was just an oversight, a silly mistake that would sort itself out the next day. She went and knelt beside the tortoise, which had already tucked itself in for the night. Timidly, she tapped the shell with her knuckles. The tortoise put its head out and looked at her. "Excuse me," Momo said. "I apologize for waking you. But can you tell me why none of my friends came? I waited all day long." "All gone," the shell spelled out. Momo read the words but couldn't follow their meaning. "Oh well," she said cheerfully. "I'll find out tomorrow. My friends are bound to come, aren't they?" "Never again," replied the tortoise. Momo stared at the faint letters with growing dismay. "What do you mean?" she asked eventually. "Has something happened to them?" "All gone," she read again. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. "They can't have." "You must be wrong, Cassiopeia. Why, I saw them only yesterday at our Grand Council of War. The one that came to nothing." "Not yesterday," Cassiopeia replied. Momo remembered now. Professor Aura had told her that she would have to wait like a seed slumbering in the earth until it was ready to sprout. She had agreed without stopping to wonder how long that meant, but now the truth was beginning to dawn on her. "How long have I been away?" she asked in a whisper. "A year and a day." Momo took some time to digest this. "But Beppo and Guido," she stammered. "Surely they're still waiting for me." "No one left," she read. "But I don't understand." Momo's lips were trembling. "They can't all be gone. Not my friends. Not the times we spent together." Very slowly, a single word lit up on Cassiopeia's shell. Past. For the first time in her life, Momo grasped the terrible finality of the word. Her heart had never felt so heavy. "But," she murmured helplessly, "but I'm still here." She longed to cry, but couldn't. A moment later, she felt the tortoise nudge her bare foot. "So am I," she read. "Yes," she said, smiling bravely. "You're here too, Cassiopeia, and I'm glad of your company. Come on, let's go to bed." Picking up the tortoise, she carried it through the hole in the wall and down into her room. She saw by the light of the setting sun that all was just as she had left it. Beppo had tidied the place up after its invasion by the men in gray. But everything was thick with dust and shrouded in cobwebs. Then she caught sight of an envelope propped against a can on the little table. The envelope, too, was covered with cobwebs. "To Momo," it said. Momo's heart began to race. No one had ever written her a letter before. She picked up the envelope and examined it from every angle, then tore it open and unfolded the slip of paper inside. "Dear Momo," she read, "I've moved. If you come back, please get in touch with me at once. I miss you and worry about you a lot. I hope nothing has happened to you. If you're hungry, go to Nino's place. I'll foot the bill, so be sure to eat as much as you want. Nino will tell you the rest. Keep on loving me. I still love you. Yours ever, Guido." Momo took a long time to decipher this letter, even though Guido had obviously been at pains to write as neatly and legibly as possible. The daylight had gone by the time she finished reading, but she felt comforted. She took the tortoise and put it on the bed beside her. "You see, Cassiopeia," she said as she wrapped herself in the dusty blanket, "I'm not alone after all." But the tortoise seemed asleep already, and Momo, who had pictured Guido's face with the utmost clarity while reading his letter, never suspected that the envelope had been lying there for almost a year. She pillowed her cheek on it, feeling cold no longer. That's the end of chapter 13. Thanks, bye!